It's time for chapter 26 today. Are you excited? Because I'm getting excited. We're getting into the good part. We're getting towards the end. So, yesterday they were split into groups at the conference, and now I think Catherine had came up with the theory that all the people that were put in the one group was on the plane as babies. So, chapter 26. Why? Jonah whispered, but Jonah knew the answer. He didn't even have to think about it. Beware, they are coming back to get you. The words from the letter echoed in his mind, leaving room for nothing else but panic. Chip. Oh, Chip, he whispered in his friend's ear. If they say, great news, we got an offer to give out free airplane rides this morning. Don't get on the plane. Do you hear me? Don't get on any freaking plane. Okay, Chip said, puzzled. He apparently hadn't figured anything out, the way Catherine and Jonah had. He hadn't been able to hear their conversation. Jonah didn't have time to fill him in. He turned back to Catherine. Catherine, you've got to tell them you're not Daniela, he said. Maybe that will stop them. Maybe if they just realize she's still in Michigan or wherever. They just put me in another group, Catherine said. I'm not leaving you and Chip. She crossed her arms stubbornly and jetted out her lower lip just like she always did anytime she fought with Jonah. But today, Jonah loved her for it. Loved her for even as he wondered, what if something happens to me and Catherine both? That would kill Mom and Dad. Besides, you need me around to figure things out, Catherine argued. You're not the only one with a brain, he countered. I'm the only one whose brain isn't traumatized, Catherine said, looking at Chip, who just now seemed to be putting everything together. His face had gone pale and he was mouthing the words, plane? Do you really think? I think, I don't know, I just kind of think Catherine seems like the older sibling, don't you? And really she's younger. At the front of the group, still several steps up on the staircase, Mr. Hodge clapped his hands together. All right, group, let's get started. We're the lucky ones. We get to go outside first. While Carol's group is sitting in a classroom, he said. Does that mean we'll get stuck in a classroom this afternoon? Someone asked. It was one of those kids with the skull sweatshirts. Jonah missed Mr. Hodge's answer because he was thinking, oh, please, an ordinary classroom with some ordinary dull adult voice droning on. So the greatest danger is that I might fall asleep. Jonah knew he was in greater danger than that. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his system, his whole body on alert, but he didn't know what he was supposed to do with all that adrenaline. He didn't know exactly what the danger was. He didn't really believe they were going to be herded onto a plane. But do they need an airplane to send us somewhere? Sometimes. What if it's like what happened to Angela, where we take one step forward and suddenly we're gone? Catherine jabbed an elbow into his ribs. Jonah realized that he'd begun swinging his head from side to side, his arms tense and his fists ready like someone looking for a fight. Don't act so weird, she whispered. People are starting to stare. Jonah dropped his fist and forced himself to concentrate on what Mr. Hodge was saying. Before I go on, I need to introduce Gary Payne, another caseworker who will be assisting me with your group today, he said. Gary, come on up here. A younger man dressed more casually in a sweatshirt and jeans jogged up the stairs to stand by Mr. Hodge. He was barely taller than Mr. Hodge, but he was much bulkier. Jonah could see bulging muscles where Gary had pushed his sweatshirt sleeves. Muscles? Is that E? Jonah leaned over and whispered urgently to Catherine and Chip. Helplessly, they both shrugged. Who could tell? On the hike, I'll lead the way and Gary will bring up the rear. To make sure there aren't any stragglers, Mr. Hodge said, grinning to make it seem like a joke. Like, who would want to lag behind on such a beautiful day, on such a lovely hike? Mr. Hodge began explaining the point of the hike, something about fitting into nature, finding one's identity through connecting with one's environment. For the first part of the hike, I want you to walk in complete silence, to really concentrate on what you're seeing around you, he said. Then we'll stop and chat about what we've discovered in that silence. We're not allowed to talk, Jonah thought, his panic spiking again. Not to each other, not to the other kids. Let's head for the middle of the pack, Catherine said, so Gary and Mr. Hodge can't see us talking. Oh, that's right, break the rules. It was strange how much relief Jonah felt realizing that was possible. Mr. Hodge jumped down from the stairs and began leading the group through a hallway and out a door at the back of the school. Jonah let about a dozen kids file out ahead of him. He could see them stretched out across the yard in the sunshine, headed for the woods of the nature preserve. It was a cheerful scene, but Jonah got chills watching it. It reminded him of something from when he was a little kid. The Pied Piper, he thought. He and Catherine had had a book of fairy tales when they were little. She had loved it, but he hated it because of that one illustration that frightened him. The one of the Pied Piper leading the children of Hamelin to their doom. In the picture, the children were skipping and laughing and dancing to the piper's tune, but Jonah knew what was going to happen to them. He couldn't stand for them to be so happy when they ought to be scared. Mr. Hodge isn't playing any music, Jonah reminded himself. He's not magical. He can't force us to do anything we don't want to. And yet Jonah was following him, pushing his way out the door. We've got to warn the other kids, Jonah muttered to Chip and Catherine. Catherine looked startled, but Chip nodded and fell back to talk to the boy behind them. I'm Chip Winston, he heard Chip say softly. I called you a few weeks ago. Have you gotten any more strange letters? No, that approach would take too long. What if they had only a few minutes? Jonah sped up and fell into step with the girl ahead of them. He didn't even take the time to glance at her name tag to see if she'd been on the survivors list or not. You can't trust Mr. Hodge or Gary, he muttered. Pass it on. She gave him an "are you crazy" look and pointedly did not step forward to talk to anyone else. Jonah sighed and stepped up to the next kid himself. You can't trust Mr. Hodge or Gary, he whispered quickly. We're in danger. Be careful. Jonah reached 3 more kids before he felt a hand on his shoulder. Just as they were about to step into the woods, it was Gary, who'd rushed up from the end of the line. Didn't you hear the instructions? He hissed in Jonah's ear. This is the silent part of the walk. If you can't follow the directions, you'll have to stay at the back of the line with me. So they stood at the edge of the woods while all the other kids filed past. Catherine shot Jonah a white-faced, worried look as she walked by, but there was nothing she could do. Chip didn't even glance in Jonah's direction. Good, Jonah thought. Pretend you don't know me. Then they won't be watching you, and you can give out the rest of the warnings. He could feel the weight of Gary's hand still on his shoulder, heavier than it should be, holding him in place. Finally, the last kid walked past, and Gary let go. Okay, your turn, Gary said quietly, but remember, no more talking. How could Jonah talk when Gary was right behind him watching? Despairing, Jonah trudged forward. He could see the other kids snaking along the trail ahead of him, going deeper and deeper into the woods. Jonah had managed to talk to only 5 of them. Even if Chip reached all the others, would they believe him? What could they do, anyhow? After about a mile, Jonah realized that Mr. Hodge was gathering everyone together at the front of the line. Circle up, he called out. He was standing on a rock now so they all could see him. Jonah joined the back of the crowd and tried to inconspicuously angle himself away from Gary toward Catherine and Chip. Gary didn't try to hold Jonah back, but Jonah could feel his eyes on him. Few people know this, but there's a rather extensive cave back here, right off the path, Mr. Hodge was saying. It's one of the best-kept secrets of Clarksville. It's usually off limits to the public, but we've received special permissions to take all of you. We'll talk about your identities in the cave. So would you go into a dark cave where nobody really goes with strangers? Not me. Did those words sound ominous to anyone else? Jonah looked around, but most of the kids just looked bored and distant, as if this was a particularly dull class at school. Mr. Hodge bent down, ready to scramble down from the rock, but then he straightened up again. Oh, I almost forgot, he said. There's a really interesting rock formation right as you enter the cave. I forget the exact scientific explanation, but there's something odd about the composition of the rock. So if you spread your hand out and touch it on the right spot, you can feel one patch of this stone that's about 15 degrees colder than the rest of the rock. It's very bizarre. I'll show you where to touch as we're going in. Then he hopped down from the rock and led them downhill, down a winding offshoot trail toward a crevice behind the rock. Touch right here, he instructed the first boy behind him, a gangly kid who kept tripping over his own feet. Mr. Hodge pointed to an outcropping along a towering stone wall. Spread your fingers out and feel it. Yeah, the boy said, sounding surprised. Now, you go on through there and you can sit on one of those benches at the back of the cave, Mr. Hodge said. Next. Jonah watched a girl repeat the same process. After barely a second with her hand against the wall, she jerked it back. Ow! "Oh, you couldn't have felt it that quickly," Mr. Hodge said. "It doesn't hurt. Here, I'll show you." And he took her hand and pressed it against the rock once more. "See?" Mr. Hodge said. "Sure," the girl said, but Jonah had the impression that she was just trying to get away. She followed the gangly boy into the cave. Jonah watched the next few kids and watched the way Mr. Hodge seemed to determine that each kid's touch the rock, that each hand linger on the rock for at least a couple of seconds. It reminded him of something from a movie, a scene he couldn't quite remember. It was a movie he'd watched at school in science, the one about that horrible epidemic, maybe. Oh yeah, when the scientists went into their laboratories where all the deadly viruses were kept, they had to place their hands on a scanner to get in and to prove who they were. There couldn't be any dangerous viruses in the cave, could there? Not with it hanging open and the air circulating freely. Jonah saw his mistake. "Catherine," he spoke up, through gritted teeth, because Mr. Hodge was looking back at him, looking at all the kids coming down the hill. Catherine turned her head. Maybe it would just look as if she had heard an unusual bird call and was trying to listen more closely. Jonah pretended to trip, stumbling against Catherine's back. "That's a hand scanner," he hissed in her ear. "Like fingerprinting. They're checking our identities, making sure we really are the babies from the plane, I bet. Whatever you do, don't touch that rock. Just pretend." He watched Mr. Hodge pressing the other kids against the rock, forcing the palm flat against the stone. Jonah changed his mind. "No," he told Catherine. Run back to Mom and Dad and tell them we're in danger. Tell them to come and save us." Catherine shook her head, nervous, and red spots standing out on her pale face. "What could I say that they'd believe?" she whispered. "No, I'm staying with you." Jonah thought about grabbing his sister, holding her back, dragging her away to Mom and Dad in safety, or just bolting himself. The muscles in his backs of his legs tingled, wanting to take off, but all but screaming, "Run!" All the adrenaline in his body seemed to have pooled there. It was like the moment in a basketball game when every cell in his body seemed to know, "Time for your breakaway, now go!" But what about all these other kids, the ones he and Chip had never gotten a chance to warn? The ones stepping so trustingly into the cave? The ones marveling so stupidly to Mr. Hodge, "Oh, you're right, it is cold." The ones who were actually giggling. How could he leave them behind? The kids in front of him kept stepping up to the rock, then into the cave, and the kids behind him pressed forward, trapping him and Catherine and Chip between them and the stone wall, the rock and the cave. Even if Jonah decided to run now, he couldn't. The girl in front of Jonah moved up to the stone wall. It was Andrea Crawwell. Jonah recognized the braids from behind. She pressed her hands firmly against the rock, tilted her head to one side, deliberating, and she turned to Mr. Hodge. "Does it have to do something with the oxidation levels?" she asked. Behind Andrea, Catherine held her hand toward the wall, only Jonah was in a position to see that she didn't actually touch it, that she kept a millimeter of air between her fingertips and the rock. She stood there like that for a long time and then slipped past Andrea into the cave while Mr. Hodge was explaining to Andrea. "I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I've heard the explanation, and it might be something about that. But what did you call it? Oops, hold on there, young lady. Did you touch the rock?" He was talking to Catherine. Now, he'd seen her trying to slip past. "She did. She took forever," Jonah complained. "Isn't it my turn now?" Quickly, probably hoping that nobody would notice, Mr. Hodge looked back toward Gary, who was watching from the end of the line. Gary gave a small nod, and Mr. Hodge let Catherine pass. Jonah stepped up to the rock. His knees were trembling now, and all the adrenaline seemed to have drained away. Had he just saved his sister, or doomed her? So she got in, and now it's his turn to get ready to go in. Wonder what's going to happen in the cave. Ooh. All right, chapter 27 is tomorrow. Have a great day.